Chapter 1. A sound at dusk. It was a Sunday evening in late September when the bell rang from the old stone church of St. Mildred's. A sound that shouldn't have been heard at all. The village of Farncombe-on-Way was a quiet place, even by English countryside standards. The stone cottages stood clustered near a single high street, ivy creeping up their weathered facades, and roses blooming with tenacity in small, neatly kept gardens. It was the kind of village where gossip traveled faster than the milkman's cart, and where everyone knew precisely how many sugars you took in your tea. The church, St. Mildred's, had stood at the far end of the village green for over 4 centuries. With its slate roof, crooked steeple, and moss-covered gravestones, it had borne silent witness to countless baptisms, weddings, and funerals. But the bell, a large bronze casting that dated from 1703, had not been rung in years. The steeple was deemed unsafe, and the bell pull was removed and locked away in the vestry. That's why the sound of the bell, deep, resonant, and ringing out just after 6 o'clock, had sent a shiver through Farncombe's quiet peace. Miss Jane Marple was sitting by the bay window of her cottage, halfway through her embroidery of a rather willful hydrangea, when the bell tolled. Her needle paused mid-stitch, and her pale blue eyes narrowed. She waited and heard it again, 3 long tolls, with a slight pause between each. Then silence. It was not a bell rung in joy or ceremony. It was not even a full peal, just 3 singular, haunting notes that echoed across the green like a summons. Moments later, the telephone rang, a tinny trill that echoed oddly after the bell's deep boom. It was Mrs. Amelia Carter from the Women's Institute. "Jane, did you hear it? The bell, the church bell." "I did," Miss Marple replied calmly. 3 chimes. "Quite distinctive, but it's impossible. Reverend Thomas said it's been disconnected, and the steeples unsafe." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, already reaching for her cardigan, "which makes it all the more curious." She ended the call, placed her embroidery gently aside, and stepped into the cool evening air. A small crowd had already gathered on the green by the time Miss Marple arrived, all peering up at the church, murmuring in hushed tones. Reverend Thomas himself stood by the locked entrance, his thick eyebrows furrowed into a look of profound confusion. "I heard it with my own ears," said old Mr. Wilbraham, who had manned the church bell decades ago before arthritis claimed. His hands, same tone, same vibration, no mistake. "I say," muttered the vicar, looking up at the steeple. "It couldn't be wind, could it? Some odd acoustical echo?" "The sky still as a pressed flower," Miss Marple noted, glancing upward. "And there hasn't been a breeze all day." Constable Merriweather, a mild young man with a permanently anxious expression, arrived on his bicycle a few minutes later. "Right then, everyone, let's keep calm. No need to go jumping to conclusions. It's probably children," sniffed Mrs. Partridge, the postmistress. "They're always poking about. Locking the church doesn't mean they can't climb in through a window." "But who would ring a bell and then disappear?" asked Mr. Giles, the butcher. "And why only 3 times? No one had an answer to that. The church itself, once opened by the vicar with trembling hands, revealed nothing out of place. The vestry was locked, the rope removed as reported. The steeple ladder was untouched and coated in years of dust. The bell had not been physically swung. Then how?" The vicar asked weakly, turning to Miss Marple. She was examining the floor, near the bell pull's former housing. Kneeling, she brushed a faint trail of white powder with the edge of her handkerchief. "Chalk dust," she murmured. "Is that significant?" asked Constable Merriweather, notebook poised. "It might be, or it might not," she replied. The constable looked baffled, which was quite usual when Miss Marple spoke like that. She had the gift of making the obvious seem extraordinary, and vice versa. The crowd was dispersing when young Daphne Hill ran up, face pale. "I've just come from the vicarage," she gasped. "Mrs. Walker, the housekeeper, she's found someone in the choir loft. Someone? The vicar echoed, eyes wide. Alive? I don't know. She was sobbing when she called me. Said it was a man, just lying there. By the time Miss Marple and the others reached the choir loft, a narrow space behind the chancel, Constable Merriweather was already crouched beside the body. It was a man in his late 50s, smartly dressed in a navy suit and brown brogues. His face was turned toward the stained glass window, expression calm as if asleep. But the blood told another story. A dark stain at the back of his head, where it had struck the stone edge of a pew. A small pool had gathered by the base of the step. He's dead, the constable said solemnly, rising to his feet. Reverend Thomas crossed himself. Miss Marple, still and pale, looked not at the body, but at the neatness of the man's appearance. His shoes had been polished recently, his tie properly knotted. A fresh-cut flower, a white carnation, was still pinned to his lapel. His wristwatch had stopped at precisely 6:03. A visitor, she said softly. Not a local. I don't recognize him, do you? Heads shook around the loft. No wallet, the constable said, flipping through the man's coat. Just this. He held up a folded note. It reads, "Forgive me for what I must do, no signature." A wave of whispers followed, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Suicide? The vicar offered hesitantly. Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She stepped closer, fingers grazing the edge of the pew. People rarely bash the backs of their heads in order to end their lives, she said softly, and certainly not with such tidy shoes. The constable shifted uncomfortably. Could have. Fallen, perhaps. But her tone, light though it was, suggested she didn't quite believe it. And then came a meow, faint but distinct. Everyone turned. The cat, the vicarage's gray and white mouser, nimble, sat at the edge of the choir rail, tail twitching. Miss Marple bent to look where the cat stared, beneath the pews. A thin object lay half hidden in shadow, a brass key. Glinting dully in the fading light, she picked it up with a handkerchief. It seems, she murmured, that our visitor had access to more than one locked place. As dusk slipped into full night and the constable made arrangements with the local doctor, Miss Marple stood once again outside the church. The wind had risen now, sighing through the yew trees, but the bell remained still. She looked back at the high tower, the windows glowing faintly from lantern light inside. A bell. That should not have rung, she whispered to herself, and a man who should not have died. She touched the carnation she'd carefully taken from the man's lapel, now wrapped in wax paper in her pocket, and turned back toward the village green, where gossip was already blooming like wildflowers in spring. Chapter 2. The Village. Rex SD. Mildred's church had not seen such stirring since the spring fete of 1934, when Reverend Pottle's goose had absconded into the communion garden and pecked the Bishop of Maidstone. But on this damp October morning, the village of Marchbolt buzzed not with laughter, but with consternation. A bell tolling in the dead of night, empty church, a found body, and the mystery of who had summoned death. These were not every day occurrences. By 8:30, the news had traveled from the vicarage garden to Mrs. Cooper's bakery, and thence on to the high street, where it began to ferment into speculation. The chiming of the bell had been heard by few, but those who had heard it, such as old Mr. Jeffers, who lived just 3 doors from the church and suffered from chronic insomnia, repeated the tale with increasing elaboration. Miss Hartnell, the retired headmistress, declared she had known something was amiss when the crows rose from the churchyard trees like ink in water. Mrs. Cooper insisted she had seen a dark figure rushing past her bakery window around the same time the bell tolled. Her daughter, young Peggy Cooper, swore it had been a woman in a long cloak. Her mother promptly hushed her and muttered that the girl had been reading too many penny dreadfuls. The police, represented by Inspector Crail, had cordoned off the church by morning. A man had indeed been found just beneath the bell tower, his body lying as though in prayer, arms crossed over his chest and no sign of struggle. No wounds, no blood, nothing outwardly sinister. But he was quite dead, and he was not from Marchbolt. The Reverend Thomas Pottle, gaunt and still shaken, stood beside the inspector, wringing his hat between his hands. He wasn't from our parish, he repeated for what must have been the 5th time that morning. I've never seen the man before. Came in through the vestry, he must have. The doors were unlocked last evening for the flower committee. Inspector Crail, a short, practical man with a mustache that made up for his thinning scalp, furrowed his brow. Unlocked, you say? Reckless habit, Reverend. And no one else with keys? The vicar hesitated. Just Mrs. Larch, our verger, and perhaps Mr. Amory, the organist. But I dare say neither would come in during the night. Miss Marple, who had quietly arrived at the churchyard's edge, stood behind the iron fence, her gloved hands folded over her reticule. From where she stood, she could observe not only the growing crowd, but the subtle gestures, whispers, and expressions that flickered like candlelight through the gathering. She noted that young Peggy Cooper looked frightened, yes, but also excited. Like someone playing a part, Mr. Jeffers was already spinning the tale as if he were auditioning for the wireless. She turned as Dr. Bassett, the local physician, emerged from the church with his medical bag swinging at his side. His ruddy face was unusually pale. Well, Crail asked. Any sign of how he died? Dr. Bassett shook his head. No obvious trauma, no bruises or punctures. No sign of poisoning from a cursory glance. I'd hazard it was cardiac, perhaps a sudden failure. I'll know more after the post-mortem, of course. Not the sort to just drop dead in a church tower, though. Is he? Crail muttered. Miss Marple's ears twitched, though she kept her gaze on the ivy that curled up the bell tower. She had learned long ago that it was not the loud declarations that revealed the truth, but the murmurs and the silences. Across the way, a young man in a gray coat stood with his hands clenched. Miss Marple did not recognize him. His collar was fine linen, his boots freshly polished. A Londoner, she guessed. His posture was military upright, poised, but his eyes were scanning the faces around him. Not in curiosity, but calculation. She tilted her head ever so slightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, turning to Mrs. Merriweather, who stood next to her holding a buttered bun and wearing a bonnet 2 decades out of fashion. "Do you happen to know who that young gentleman is standing near the gatepost?" Mrs. Merriweather squinted. "Him? Oh, he came down on the 7:15 train from Paddington, they say. Asked for directions to the church. Name's Mr. Lionel Blackwood, a solicitor or something. Someone said he was staying at the Lamb and Lantern last night." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "How very curious he should arrive just this morning. Coincidence?" "Perhaps," said Mrs. Merriweather, taking a bite of her bun. "Perhaps," murmured Miss Marple, though her eyes never left the man in the gray coat. Back by the church steps, Inspector Crail addressed the gathering. "The deceased has not been identified. We found no identification on his person. If anyone has any information or saw anyone entering or leaving the church between the hours of 10 and 3 last night, they must come forward." The crowd murmured, but no one volunteered. As the onlookers began to drift away, Miss Marple made her way through the lich gate and toward the Reverend Pottle. She greeted him gently. "My dear Reverend, how very distressing for you." The vicar gave a hollow laugh. "Yes, Miss Marple. I can scarcely believe it. A dead man in my church. Did you notice anything out of place when you arrived this morning?" she asked. He blinked. "Not beyond the obvious. The door was ajar. The candles had been lit, though they burned low. That was strange. And of course, the bell." "Yes," said Miss Marple, almost to herself. "The bell. Such a curious thing, to ring it in the dead of night. Not an accident, I suppose. I think not. One must pull quite hard on the rope to sound it, and the tower is quite narrow. Not a place for sleepwalking or wandering children, or burglars." She asked, watching his expression. "No sign of robbery." The alms box was untouched. Miss Marple gave a slight nod. And the bell rope? Still swinging when I arrived. Though the man was dead already, she turned back toward the bell tower. Then someone rang it after the man died. Or to signal that he had. Or perhaps, she added thoughtfully, to draw someone's attention. The Reverend said nothing, but his eyes widened slightly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So often in life, the bell is used to mark death after it happens. How unusual that this one might have rung before. As she walked away, the autumn leaves crunched beneath her sensible shoes. The wind had picked up, sending eddies of brown and gold dancing across the path. Miss Marple paused just at the edge of the churchyard and glanced back once more at the tower, her expression unreadable. Already, she had begun to form her quiet hypotheses, drawn not from footprints or fingerprints, but from expressions, half-spoken. Names and a curious alignment of time, place, and intention. The bell had tolled from an empty church. But Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of one who had watched many lives unfold, that there was no such thing as an empty church. Not when guilt lingered in the pews. Not when secrets echoed louder than sermons. And not when death had called and been answered. Chapter 3. The man without a name. The rain had begun by the time Miss Marple reached the high street. Not the heavy, dramatic sort that drenched one's shoes and demanded umbrellas, but a persistent misting drizzle that blurred the windows of shops and turned the cobblestones slit beneath careful feet. Marchbolt, like most English villages, wore the rain with quiet resignation. Miss Marple, having stopped briefly at Grantley's for a spool of darning thread and a modest seed cake, turned up her collar and made her way toward the Lamb and Lantern. The inn stood modestly at the far end of the high street, its brickwork darkened with age and smoke, a place that smelled perpetually of roast lamb, fireplace ash, and pipe tobacco. It was there, she had learned, that the young man in the gray coat, Mr. Lionel Blackwood, had taken lodging the night before. She did not go in, not yet. Instead, she paused just beneath the eaves and allowed her gaze to drift, apparently idly, across the windows above. The innkeeper's daughter, Agnes, was dusting the windowsill of the corner room. Miss Marple gave her a small, grandmotherly smile. "Good morning, Agnes, dear," she said with perfect casualness. "A dreary morning, isn't it?" Agnes, a red-cheeked girl with a tendency to talk more than was strictly appropriate, smiled back. "Oh, dreadful, Miss Marple. I nearly slipped on the back steps this morning. I do hope you weren't bringing up breakfast to the new guest, Mr. Blackwood, was it?" Agnes giggled. "That's right. Nice enough fellow, very proper. Didn't say much, though he did ask rather a lot of questions about the church last night." "Did he indeed?" Miss Marple arched a snowy brow, such as, "Well, it was curious," said Agnes, leaning her elbows on the sill despite her mother's many lectures on posture. "He wanted to know if the bell tower was still used, and whether anyone lived near enough to hear it at night." "How?" "Very precise of him," murmured Miss Marple. Agnes nodded eagerly. "Then this morning, after the news came, he looked ever so pale. Asked if it was the same church he'd asked about." "And what did you say?" "I told him it surely was, as there's only one church in Marchbolt." He didn't say much after that, just thanked me and went down to speak with someone in the parlor. Said Miss Marple, and with a parting nod, she continued down the lane. She did not yet know what Mr. Lionel Blackwood had to do with the body in the church, but she was increasingly certain that his arrival was no coincidence. People rarely inquired about church bells for innocent reasons, nor did they arrive at inns the night before anonymous corpses were found beneath said bells. By late morning, Inspector Crail had set up a temporary base at the police station, a narrow, ivy-smothered building adjacent to the post office. It was there that Miss Marple made her next visit, her gloves still damp from the rain. "You again, Miss Marple," said Crail, not unkindly. He gestured for her to sit. "You've a better nose for these matters than half the village. Though, I warn you, I haven't anything new to share." "Oh, I'm not here to press, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Only to offer something you may find curious. Crail leaned back, eyeing her with interest. Go on. I've heard, from a most dependable source, that Mr. Lionel Blackwood, our young visitor from London, was inquiring after the church bell before the unfortunate discovery this morning. And furthermore, he appeared greatly distressed when informed that it was, in fact, St. Mildred's in which the body had been found. Crail frowned. That's so? We spoke briefly. Said he'd come down on business. Claimed he was meeting a client at the inn. Never said anything about churches or bells. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. People rarely lie outright, Inspector. They simply rearrange the order of events. I find that what is omitted is often more telling than what is said. Crail gave a grunt. All the same, we've no identification on the deceased. No wallet, no papers, not a single mark on him. But the initials WF stitched faintly into his shirt collar. Miss Marple tilted her head. Not new stitching, I assume. No, Crail said. Old, worn thread. Possibly original. Which tells us little, unless one of your acquaintances happens to recall a man with those initials, and a penchant for late-night visits to empty churches. Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She was thinking of someone. A man who had once rented rooms in Paddington, near where her niece's cousin lived. A quiet fellow who used a typewriter and spoke with a Midlands accent. His name, she recalled, was Walter Finch. Or was it Wilfred? Crail sighed. We'll send the man's fingerprints to London. Might take a day or two. I've also asked our London branch to check missing persons or deaths from the last week. Was the man dressed well? Miss Marple asked. Any inkling of his class or habits? Modest, respectable clothing, clean nails. Shaved the day before, at least. Well fed. Could have been a clerk or a teacher. Certainly not a vagrant. Miss Marple rose slowly, gathering her gloves. And Mr. Blackwood? Still at the inn, Crail said. Though I imagine he won't be for long, especially now that I know he was sniffing around the church. I'll have a word with him this afternoon. Miss Marple paused at the door. You might find, Inspector, that Mr. Blackwood is not as much involved as he is connected. People sometimes arrive just after terrible things happen because they have been following trouble, not causing it. Following trouble? Miss Marple gave a slight smile. Or perhaps, following someone in trouble. Back at the Lamb and Lantern, Lionel Blackwood paced the length of his rented room. The rain beat lightly against the window pane, and from somewhere down below, he could hear the muffled laughter of the innkeeper's boy. He stared at the letter. On the desk dot, it had arrived 3 days ago, unsigned and written in a tight, slanted hand. You will find what you're seeking in Marchbolt. Midnight at the bell. Come alone. He had not told the police about it, and now the man was dead, that evening, as the clouds broke just enough to let through a bruised violet sky. Miss Marple took her place by the fire in her parlor at Hillside Cottage. Her knitting lay in her lap, untouched. She had not yet solved the riddle, but her shape was forming vague and fog-like, yes, but steadily solidifying. A man had come to Marchbolt seeking answers that another had come to silence him, and someone had rung the bell to make sure someone else would hear. The question, of course, was not only who had died, but for whose benefit the bell had rung at all. Chapter 4. Visitor at Hillside Cottage. It was just past 11 o'clock the next morning when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. The rain had finally abated, leaving Marchbolt swaddled in that fresh-washed hush that follows a long downpour. Birds chirped with restored enthusiasm from the hedgerows, and the roses outside Hillside Cottage leaned heavy-headed. Under the weight of lingering dew. Miss Marple was in the drawing room, her lap full of pale yellow wool and knitting needles. Clicking gently when the knot came firm, precise, neither hesitant nor overly bold. She placed her work aside, adjusted her cardigan, and answered the door herself. Standing before her was a tall man in his early 30s, his coat impeccably tailored despite the country mud at its hem. His dark hair was combed back with meticulous care, and his eyes gray, alert, faintly troubled met hers with a certain reluctant deference. "Miss Marple? I am she," she replied gently. "Do come in, Mr. Blackwood." He blinked, just once. You know me?" "Word travels quickly in Marchbolt," she said mildly. "Especially about those who arrive just before a murder." He gave a sharp exhale that was half a laugh, half a sigh. "I suppose it would." She led him inside with her usual understated hospitality, gesturing to a fireside chair as she settled. Opposite, there was tea already on the side table. Miss Marple was always prepared for a visitor by mid-morning, and she poured a cup without asking. "Milk? Sugar? Both, please," said Mr. Blackwood, sitting with an air of deliberate composure. "I must apologize for this intrusion. I've been told you're rather skilled at noticing things." "I do like to observe," Miss Marple said, stirring his tea with a small clink. "But more than that, I've lived long enough to see. Patterns, human patterns. They rarely change, you know." He accepted the teacup with a quiet thank you, then stared into it a moment before speaking. "I came to Marchbolt to meet someone. A man I hadn't seen in 6 years, and now he's dead." Miss Marple said nothing. Her blue eyes watched him steadily, the way one might watch a chessboard with only a few pieces remaining. He continued. "His name was Walter Ferris. We worked together in a solicitor's office in Birmingham back in 1937. I was still articling then. He was ... double quotes." He paused. "Different. Clever. Secretive. Always seemed to have one foot in a shadow the rest of us couldn't see." "Was he your friend?" Blackwood gave a brittle smile. "No, not really. He was the sort of man you admire, and then regret admiring. After the war broke out, he vanished. Disappeared entirely in 1940. Some said he'd gone abroad. Others thought he died. I tried to find him once or twice. And then, 5 days ago, I received a letter." He took a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. Miss Marple unfolded it with care. The handwriting was spidery and tight. "Come to Marchbolt. You will have your answers. At midnight, the bell. Tell no one." There was no signature. "And so you came," she said. "I did. I arrived late, asked after the church, stayed the night at the inn. I hadn't planned to go to the church at midnight. I thought it might be some absurd prank, but then I heard the bell. I looked out my window. No one was there. I didn't go to the church." He paused. "I regret that now." "You didn't go," Miss Marple repeated, thoughtfully. "But you knew that someone had, because someone died." "Yes, I recognized him this morning. I went to the station and told the inspector. He hasn't quite decided what to make of me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And do you know why Walter Ferris sent for you?" Blackwood hesitated. I think it may have had to do with something from the war. Something he got mixed up in. He was never one for open daylight, Miss Marple. He lived in margins." She noted the faint tremor in his hand as he set down the cup. "Secrets have long shadows, Mr. Blackwood," she said gently. "And sometimes they stretch farther than we expect." There was a short silence. Outside, the sound of children shouting echoed from the village green. A dog barked once, then again. Finally, Blackwood rose. "I've told you more than I told." "The inspector, I don't know why, I suppose because you listen." "Thank you, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "I find that people say what they most need to say when offered a cup of tea and a quiet room. You're welcome here, Mr. Blackwood. But tread carefully. Marchbolt is small, and the truth rarely stays hidden for long." He bowed his head slightly, then turned and left, his figure soon swallowed by the hedgerows beyond her gate. That afternoon, the coroner arrived from Truro. Miss Marple saw him alight from the train, a man with salt-white hair and a sour expression, carrying a battered case. Inspector Crail accompanied him back to the church for a second. More thorough examination. The news reached Hillside Cottage by dusk. "Cause of death is clear now," said Dr. Haydock, who had dropped by to return a book Miss Marple had lent him. Blunt force trauma to the base of the skull. Likely struck from behind. Death was instantaneous. No defensive wounds. No sign of struggle. None, which means the poor devil didn't see it coming. A sneak attack, Miss Marple nodded. "I see. And get this," Haydock added. "The coroner believes death occurred no more than 15 minutes before the bell was rung." She looked up. "That recently?" "Indeed, so someone killed the man and then rang the bell, possibly as a distraction. Or a signal." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window. The sky was darkening again, streaked with rose-gold clouds and the promise of more rain. "I wonder," she murmured, "who the bell was meant for." Haydock gave a small, baffled grunt. "What do you mean?" She turned toward him, eyes thoughtful. Perhaps it wasn't meant to draw the villagers at all. Perhaps it was meant to draw just one person. Someone watching, waiting. She didn't say who she meant, but as the first star pierced the evening sky, she couldn't help thinking of Mr. Blackwood. And of the man he never met again. Chapter 5. The keeper of the keys. By the next morning, a hush had fallen over Marchbolt, a hush deeper than usual, as if the village itself held its breath. Though the lanes were bright with soft sunshine and the roses heavy with bloom, the air seemed touched by something heavier than weather. Conversations were clipped. Faces turned away more often than toward. The villagers were not unaccustomed to gossip, but murder, especially one linked to their beloved old church, was another matter. Miss Marple rose early, as always, her mind already turning over the details that had surfaced. She had, in her quiet way, begun compiling a mental list of inconsistencies, silences, and half-truths. People often assumed that a small village was transparent, every corner exposed, but Miss Marple knew that concealment flourished best in places where people fancied they already knew everything. She tidied away her breakfast dishes, adjusted her hat, and stepped out just after 9 with no clear destination but every intention of discovering something. It was not long before she passed the old rectory. Though empty for years, the property was still maintained by the parish, its garden weeded once a season, its locks changed every 3rd year by a handyman from Truro. As she passed the gate, she noted that someone had recently disturbed the gravel path. Mud had been tracked in from boots. Not more than a day old. Interesting. Her stroll next took her past the churchyard, where a low murmur of voices drifted on the breeze. She turned the corner and saw Inspector Crail standing beside a tall, spare woman in a faded lilac coat. They were facing the church door, which now bore a fresh padlock. "Good morning, Inspector," Miss Marple called with gentle brightness. Crail turned and nodded curtly. "Miss Marple." The woman beside him gave a start and turned, her sharp nose catching the light. Miss Marple recognized her at once. Miss Lydia Froome, the church's longtime housekeeper and unofficial guardian of all things ecclesiastical. "Well, if it isn't Miss Jane Marple," Miss Froome said, folding her arms. "Come to see the old place locked up like a prison?" "I'm always fond of a morning walk," Miss Marple replied lightly. "Though I must say, it pains me to see the doors shut on St. Aidan's. I suppose there's no other choice?" Crail's mouth was a thin line. "Until we know how the victim entered the premises, no one's allowed inside. Not without my say-so. And poor Lydia," Miss Froome added with an edge, "has had to hand over every key she owns." Crail raised an eyebrow at that. "Every key that ought to exist anyway," Miss Froome bristled. "I've never lost a church key in 28 years. You'll not suggest otherwise." "Then tell me," Crail said, his voice low and probing, "how the door was unlocked when we arrived. No forced entry. No broken glass. And yet, a man lay dead inside." Miss Marple watched the exchange with the same innocent curiosity she might offer to a children's game. "I heard," she said gently, "that there was no sign of anything taken." "Correct," Crail said. His pockets were untouched, wallet intact. "No struggle, no theft, no motive we can discern." "Except," Miss Froome muttered, "he was meant to be there." Crail turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Froome hesitated, eyes flicking. Toward Miss Marple. "Oh, go on," Miss Marple said kindly. "I am very good at keeping things in my knitting basket." Lydia Froome exhaled. "I didn't tell the inspector yesterday, but ... She looked down, fingers fussing with the hem of her sleeve. "The day before the murder, I noticed the side vestry door ajar. It closes hard, you see, so I always check it before leaving. But that afternoon, I found it partly open. I thought I must have been careless. Was it locked when you returned the next day?" Crail asked. "Yes, locked tight." She hesitated. Again. But there was a faint smell, something musty, unfamiliar. "I thought nothing of it, but now ... now I wonder." Crail scribbled something in his notebook. "And you mentioned earlier about someone being meant to be there?" Miss Froome gave a nervous little laugh. "Well, it's just that 2 nights ago, I passed by the church just before 10 on my way from my cousin's, and I saw a candle flickering in the window. I thought perhaps it was the curate. But Mr. Reeve is away on family business, isn't he?" "He is," Crail said, grimly. Miss Marple's mind turned this over with careful interest. A candle. A vestry door. A smell no one could place. And a victim who had been lured to the place with a cryptic letter, and a bell rung at midnight. She turned to Lydia Froome. "Forgive me," she said with the utmost gentleness, "but you've worked at St. Ezeden's for decades. Would you know if there was an additional key? One not officially documented?" Miss Froome blinked. "There's the old master key. Reverend Lockwood had it during the war. Said it opened everything in the church, even the ancient cellar door. Behind the organ, I assumed it was lost years ago." Miss Marple pressed her hands together, not unlike a woman in prayer. "Did Walter Ferris ever serve at the church?" Crail looked up. "The victim?" "Yes," Miss Froome nodded slowly. "He was a lay reader, briefly, in 39, just before he left the village." "How convenient," murmured Miss Marple. Crail frowned. "You think he kept the master key?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that whoever wanted him inside that church knew of the key's existence. Whether they possessed it or only knew he did, that remains to be seen." Crail looked back at the church door, the morning sun, glinting off the fresh padlock. "I'll have that vestry searched again, top to bottom." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied smile. "Do," she said, "but don't be surprised if the key is never found." That afternoon, she sat in her garden with her knitting once more, but her hands moved more slowly than usual. Her thoughts drifted back to Mr. Blackwood, the nervous energy in his limbs, the curious tightness around his eyes. He had said he hadn't gone to the church that night, but if someone rang the bell to summon him, what had they expected? And if he hadn't answered the summons... who had? More importantly, who was watching to make sure that someone did? Chapter 6. The Man Who Feared Belzit. Was just past 4 in the afternoon when Mr. Archibald Blackwood knocked at Miss Marple's door. She had not expected visitors, though she had noticed him earlier in the lane walking with a quick, anxious step, head turning from side to side, as if he feared someone might be following him. That he ended up at her doorstep was not, in her estimation, entirely surprising. She opened the door with a serene smile. "Mr. Blackwood." He removed his hat, his fair hair tousled beneath it. "Forgive me for calling unannounced, Miss Marple. But," he glanced behind him, "might I speak with you privately?" "But of course," she said kindly, stepping aside. "I always say there is no hour unsuitable for a cup of tea and a few quiet thoughts." Within a few minutes, they were seated in her parlor, the tea things set out neatly. Mr. Blackwood declined a biscuit, but accepted his tea with trembling fingers. His gaze swept the room, but it was not Miss Marple's china or embroidery he was interested in. It was the silence, the reassurance of four walls and a closed door. "You believe you're being watched," Miss Marple said gently. Before he could speak, he looked up, startled. "Yes. How could you tell?" She smiled, faintly. There are few expressions more distinct than the one worn by a man who is certain a pair of eyes are always behind him. The neck stiffens, shoulders rise. Even the way you hold your teacup defensively, like a shield. Blackwood let out a short, humorless laugh. "You see everything." "No," Miss Marple replied. "But I notice things others discard." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I didn't tell the police the truth, not entirely, about the night of the murder." He nodded. "I told Inspector Crail I was at home, that I heard the bell and looked out the window, but didn't go near the church. And in fact," he hesitated. "I was there," he whispered. "Not inside, just across the road. I hid in the lane behind the hedges and watched the tower." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And what did you see, Mr. Blackwood?" His face was pale. "It was just after midnight. The bell rang once, then silence. I waited. I don't know why. Then I saw a figure, cloaked, walking from the vicarage path toward the church. They had no torch, but they moved as though they knew exactly where they were going, male or female. Tall, slim. I thought perhaps a man, but I'm not sure. They disappeared into the church through the west door. It opened without a sound." "Did you remain there long after?" "Only a few minutes. I was too frightened to stay. The church gives me a feeling. Ever since I was a boy." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with a deeper awareness. "You were raised in Marchbolt, weren't you?" "Yes, born and raised here." "Then surely the bells are nothing new." "No," he said quickly. "It's not the sound, it's the time, the midnight toll. It only happened once before, you know. Long ago." Her knitting needles had been still for some time now. "Tell me," she said softly. "When?" "I was 12. It was the winter of 27, a stormy night. The bell rang once, at midnight. Just once. People said it must have been the wind. But the next morning, the sexton was found in the tower dead. He had fallen from the narrow stair." Miss Marple took this in with silent gravity. "And you think it's connected?" Blackwood's lips were dry. "I don't know. But I've never forgotten it." He looked down, then added, "My father knew the sexton well. Sighed he had secrets." Miss Marple poured more tea for him, and in that delicate moment, as the amber liquid swirled in the porcelain, something fell into place within her, just a fragment, but enough. "Why did you not tell the inspector all of this?" "Because I thought if I said I was near the church, it would make me look guilty." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "But it also makes you an important witness." Blackwood shook his head. "Someone knew I was there, Miss Marple. I heard footsteps behind me when I turned for home. No one ever appeared, but I swear they knew I saw them." She gave him a moment of silence to let the dread settle. Then she asked, "Do you know why Walter Ferris came back to Marchbolt?" The question caught him off guard. He was looking into something. Something from the past. He told Mr. Denholm so. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, and then he received an anonymous note summoning him to the church. Whoever wrote it knew. He was coming back for answers. The bell was simply the final lure, the bait in a trap." Blackwood's hands tightened around his teacup. "I think they meant it to be me." "Yes," she said quietly. "So do I." There was a long pause, broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock dot. Then Blackwood leaned forward again. "Miss Marple, do you believe in evil?" She met his gaze. "I believe in people, and some of them carry wounds that never close. The evil is often in the silence they grow around those wounds." He looked down, as if hearing that made something inside him ache. After he left, Miss Marple did not immediately return to her knitting. Instead, she took out a small notebook from her drawer and wrote down several names: Walter Ferris, Archibald, Blackwood, Reverend Lockwood, Sexton Henry Toller, deceased. Then, beneath that, bell rang at midnight 1927 and now. Witness in both cases, Archibald. Blackwood. She drew a line between the names and tapped the pencil against the page. 2 men had died beneath that bell. Both deaths occurred after a solitary toll at midnight, and both had drawn Blackwood into the shadows of the church. But was he victim, witness, or something far more complicated? Chapter 7. Secrets in the Vestry. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that clung to window panes and whispered beneath door frames. A fine mist hovered over Marchbolt like a breath held in suspense, and the stone face of St. Petroc's Church rose stark against the ghostly sky, its bell tower looming with solemn indifference over the sleeping village. Miss Marple stood at her parlor window, watching the frost thaw upon the holly bushes and the milkman's cart trundle slowly along the lane. She had already spoken to Dr. Ainsley earlier, under the most innocent pretense of returning a library copy of the Lives of the Saints, which she had most certainly not finished reading. The doctor, always obliging when approached with kindness and a touch of gentle flattery, had been more forthcoming than usual. It was not, he admitted, a simple fall. Mr. Walter Ferris's injuries, at least those visible, showed curious bruising inconsistent with a man who had simply stumbled. There was a mark above his temple, too precise for chance. No blood. Number. Sign of true struggle. And curiously, no mud on his shoes, despite the sodden state of the grass between his cottage and the church. Crail had been notified of the findings, of course, and seemed to treat them with the distant preoccupation of a man whose attention was divided. Miss Marple stirred her tea with unusual solemnity. It was shaping into something more than idle gossip. She decided then, with the resolve of one who had spent a lifetime observing the subtlest betrayals of the human heart, that she must visit the church. It was not a venture she undertook lightly. Since Walter Ferris's death, St. Petroc's had acquired an atmosphere quite unlike the rest of Marchbolt, something detached, as though the stone walls themselves remembered more than they should. Fewer villagers passed it now. The vicar, Reverend Lockwood, had continued his duties with visible strain, and the churchyard flowers had begun to wilt without the gentle attentions of Ferris's hands. She arrived shortly before 11. The mist had begun to lift, but the air remained damp and cold. A note, penned in the Reverend's elegant slant, was pinned neatly to the church's heavy oak door. Open for quiet prayer until midday, R.L. Miss Marple, drawing her wool coat tighter about her shoulders, stepped inside. The interior of St. Petroc's was hushed, almost too hushed. No organ playing, no rustling of hymnals. Her footsteps echoed against the flagstones, each one accompanied by the faint creak of wood from the pew's aging timbers responding to the shifting cold. Candles flickered before the altar, their flames, tiny guardians of warmth in the chill. Dust motes danced in the narrow beams of colored light streaming from the stained glass windows, casting fractured hues of violet, gold, and blue upon the floor. Her eyes swept the space, noting everything. A hymn board still displaying Sunday selections. A child's scarf, red and forgotten, on the third pew. A solitary umbrella leaning against the pillar near the font. And then her gaze settled on the narrow wooden door near the altar, slightly to the left of the pulpit. The vestry. There was something about it. Perhaps its unassuming stillness, or the way the shadow clung to its edges, that called to her. She crossed the nave slowly and turned the iron handle. It creaked open, revealing a modest room filled with the faint aroma of beeswax polish and ancient paper. The vestry was a utilitarian space, lined with tall oak cupboards and a narrow writing desk beneath a stained glass depiction of St. Peter, holding a set of keys. The window's colored light cast soft reds and greens across the floor and the furniture within. She stepped inside, the door falling quietly shut behind her. The room had the feel of a place used often but kept in orderly fashion. On the desk were several church registers, stacked hymnals, and an old oil lamp whose glass chimney was clouded with soot. Above the desk, a wall calendar had been turned to February, but not marked. She glanced toward the cupboards and began, cautiously, to inspect them without touching more than necessary. The first cupboard held folded cassocks and surplices, some newly pressed, others older and worn thin at the cuffs. The second contained boxes labeled candle wicks, tithing records, and curiously, organ keys retired. She frowned slightly. The third cupboard, however, was unlocked and nearly empty. Only a single bound ledger rested on the shelf, and beside it, a small tarnished brass key dot. Miss Marple bent forward, peering closely. The key was labeled in faded ink with a single letter, T. She stared at it a long moment. Tower, she thought, and the idea struck her like a cold breeze. She reached in slowly and picked it up. It was warm to the touch, oddly so for a room this cold. Had it been handled recently? A sound echoed behind her, a firm, deliberate step in the nave. She turned, quietly slipping the key into her pocket. The vestry door creaked open, and in stepped Reverend Lockwood, a soft hat in one hand, his other hand braced on the edge of the doorway. "Miss Marple?" he said, his tone surprised but pleasant. "I didn't expect to see anyone here this morning." She offered her most benign smile. "Good morning, Reverend. I do hope I'm not intruding." The notice said the church was open. "Indeed it is. And you are most welcome." His eyes, normally kind, held a slight guardedness. "Is everything quite well?" "Oh, yes," said lightly. "I find that churches are often quite good for thinking, and these days I find there is much to think about." He nodded slowly. "I've just come from the infirmary. Mr. Denholm was taken ill during morning prayers. Collapsed entirely. They believe it was a fainting spell brought on by stress. He's been struggling since Mr. Ferris's passing." "How dreadful," said Miss Marple, her voice full of sympathy. "I hope he recovers quickly." The Reverend stepped into the vestry fully and moved to the desk, opening one of the drawers with practiced familiarity. "I left some notes here from last week's service sermon outlines, mostly. I'm afraid I've been rather scattered of late. I expect such things happen when one loses someone close to the parish." He glanced at her, then back to the drawer. Yes, Ferris was not only the sexton. He knew this building better than anyone. Every creak of it, every shifting stone. "Did he ever mention the bell tower?" she asked casually. Lockwood paused. "Not directly, though I recall. Yes, a few days before his death, he told me he'd discovered something. He said something strange about what was hidden in the old ledger." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Which ledger?" "That's just it," said the Reverend. I asked. He only smiled and said, "You'll know soon enough." It was cryptic, and Ferris was not a cryptic man by nature. She allowed a moment of silence between them. "I suppose," she said softly, "that there's more buried in this church than the dead." He looked at her sharply. "You don't believe his death was an accident?" "I believe," said Miss Marple quietly, "that no one walks across wet grass without leaving a trace." The Reverend said nothing. Outside, the church bell remained silent. Yet inside Miss Marple's thoughts, it rang with possibilities. Later that evening, back in the warm comfort of her parlor, Miss Marple pulled open the bottom drawer of her sewing cabinet and withdrew a folder, an old habit of hers, a collection of clippings and notes compiled from years of observing village life. She sorted through the pages until she found what she was looking for, an old clipping from the Marchbolt record, dated 1927. The ink had faded, but the text was still legible. "Tragic fall at St. Petro's. Sexton Henry Toller, aged 63, died after a fall from the bell tower steps. Declared accidental at inquest." Below the article, a short paragraph mentioned the only possible witness, a young boy who claimed to hear the bell toll once, just before midnight. The name was printed in block letters, Archibald Blackwood. Miss Marple sat very still, outside. The wind brushed against the eaves, whispering like a long-forgotten name. Somewhere in the quiet, something creaked softly. The bell had rung before for a death, but perhaps, this time, it had rung for a secret that never quite died. Chapter 8. Whispers after midnight. The wind carried a biting promise of rain as dusk settled across Marchbold. Street lamps flickered to life, casting thin golden beams across damp pavements. Within Hillside Cottage, Miss Marple sat knitting by her fireside, though her needles paused at each click, as if capturing the hushed tension gripping her thoughts. Outside, the night deepened 5, 6, 9, and beneath those numbers lay a pattern she had begun to trace, each stroke of time echoing in her mind like the lonely toll of a distant bell. Her reverie was broken by a gentle knock. She opened the door to find Inspector Crail, his coat drenched along the hem, and his expression lined with worry. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I was hoping to find you here indoors." "Do come in," she said, stepping aside. He entered, brushing rain from his coat, and took the chair nearest the hearth. She poured tea as he settled. "I have news," he said quietly. "It's about Miss Lydia Froome, the housekeeper." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? Do tell." "He fainted in church this morning," Crail began. "When I arrived, she was standing near the vestry door, face as pale as paper. She muttered something about lantern light seen at midnight, something from her past." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. She said she remembered. The night the sexton died. That she'd seen the same flicker of lantern light in the tower window. She recalled someone carrying something bulky. Crail nodded grimly. "I took her statement, but it was in bits broken. She might have been confused, but it was enough to alarm me." Miss Marple leaned forward. What exactly did she claim to have seen? "That someone climbed the tower, just like last night," she said. Someone held what looked like a long object, a case, maybe a tool of some sort. Miss Marple's breath caught. She thought of the ledger, the brass key, and the frightened figure in the lane. Everything seemed to turn on that stormy night. Almost 2 decades passed. Has anyone searched the tower stairs? She asked. "Not yet," Crail answered. "I've arranged to have them inspected tomorrow, though I shan't allow anyone up without good reason." "Good," Miss Marple sighed. "Tread carefully, Inspector. And thank you for telling me." He gave a tired nod, drained by the undertow of memory in Froome's words. As he left, the wind whistled again through the hedges, as though drawing long, contemplative breaths. Later that evening, Miss Marple, unable to settle back to her knitting, decided to visit the vicarage. The house stood silent under the dim gray sky, and she had barely raised her hand to knock when the door opened, revealing Reverend Lockwood. "Good evening," he said softly, stepping aside. "I thought perhaps you might call tonight." She followed him into his study, lit by a single lamp, its warmth a welcome contrast to the evening chill. "I heard about Miss Froome's fainting," she began. "Is she well?" He sighed. "I had her taken home. She's resting now. But her recollection appears tied to the tower. She's spoken of lantern light and a bulky object." Miss Marple quieted, allowing the silence to deepen. "I found something too," he said, reaching into his pocket and producing a small stained cloth. It was lodged behind the vestry radiator. Looks like oilskin, perhaps torn. Might have fallen from a case of some sort. Miss Marple took it with gentle care. The fabric was thick, gray, and used like a painter's wrap or a scientist's tool roll. "A case," she murmured, "with purpose." Lockwood gave a short nod. Ferris was working on something at the vestry desk before he died. He took the ledger from Lockwood's cupboard that day. Miss Marple glanced at the vicar sympathetically. He believed what he found in that ledger led him to this. "Everything points in that direction," the vicar said tiredly. Except I still don't know what it is. A bell tolled somewhere in the distance, deep, distant, almost ghostly. Miss Marple and Lockwood exchanged a look. Heard that? She asked softly. He nodded. The church bell only once. Late and unannounced. She sank into the armchair by the fire, gazing into the dancing flames. 3 nights ago, I heard it at midnight, she whispered. Mr. Blackwood did too. And Miss Froome? Lockwood asked quietly. She shook her head. Not that she admit, but this morning. She remembered a figure carrying something heavy up the tower. He sank into the chair opposite. Then we must search the tower. Carefully. Find any tomb-like hiding place where Ferris might have stashed whatever he discovered. Miss Marple nodded. She looked out into the night, feeling the quiet come alive with possibility. Inspector Crail has arranged it. At dawn, she said. I rather think the church and its shadows will speak tomorrow. The following dawn broke quietly. Mist still curled around the graves, and the churchyard was cold and quiet when Miss Marple arrived, just ahead of Crail and Lockwood. Lydia Froome, still pale but determined, waited at the gate, wrapped in a shawl together. They pushed open the church door and climbed the bell tower stairs, one cautious step at a time. The ladder turned out to be warped, just as Lockwood had warned, but still climbable. High above the world, everything else seemed distant. The tin bell looked solemn and still, the accumulator box beside it dusted with pale grime. The search began. Crail checked each crevice. Lockwood examined the floorboards and the old pulley. Miss Marple observed how the rope was frayed unevenly. Someone had swung it recklessly, but prevented full rings. And then, hidden behind a loose board beneath the pulley, Crail found something. A padded canvas case, damp with condensation. He pried it out and opened it slowly. Inside lay a long, slender object. An antique lantern? No, it was a sextant, an old instrument once used at sea, brass and delicate. Lockwood took it in shaking hands. Ferris took this from the sexton's cupboard when the vestry was untouched. He must have stolen it, and reasoned that it belonged in a nautical past, not here. Miss Marple handled it gently. Perhaps he thought it would lead him somewhere, someone he believed had a past at sea. Or something he believed was misplaced. Froome backed away, shoulders trembling. I helped him up the stairs, she whispered. I thought I was doing what was right, keeping Ferris safe. But I saw a figure behind him. I heard the bell. A low gasp escaped Lockwood. Crail closed his eyes. A trap. Miss Marple looked at Crail steadily. Someone wanted the sextant restored or studied. Ferris discovered he had it, tried to find who had hidden it here, and paid with his life, Crail said quietly. She looked up at the bell. The bell was rung to draw attention away, or to draw it entirely so that someone else could climb and take what they wanted. Froome sobbed quietly. Lockwood turned to her. You did not know it would end like this. She shook her head, tears slipping. I only wanted to help. Miss Marple offered a gentle hand. Some secrets lie heavy. The wrong person saw you walk it. Later, Miss Marple stood beside the silent tower, the villagers already clarifying around the morning sun. The sextant would tell its own story soon, through experts and legal filings. She looked again at the men and women around her. Blackwood would be questioned further, piecing together why he had come, what he had seen. Lockwood would bury his grief, a man who tried and failed to protect his parish. Miss Froome would recover, though her heart might never rest. And Crail would lead the inquiry, closing in on the killer, someone with ties to nautical pasts and secrets. Too long held. Miss Marple pressed a finger to her lips. Sometimes, she thought, silence is the voice of sorrow, and truth a distant echo. Chapter 9. The man in the gray coat. The rain had passed by morning, but the sky remained dulled, painted in quiet grays. The village of Marchbolt awoke slowly, as if wary of what might still be waiting among its cobbled lanes and hedgerows. Miss Marple sat alone in her small parlor, the fire long since gone to embers, though the kettle simmered dutifully on the hob. Her knitting lay beside her, untouched. Instead, she turned the brass sextant over in her hands on loan from Inspector Crail, with a caution to handle it delicately and return it before the day was out. It was heavier than it looked, worn smooth in places. She had known instruments like it. An old cousin had once captained the vessel off the Cornish coast, and Miss Marple had watched him study the stars through such a device while recounting tales of smugglers, wreckers, and desperate men. Desperate men, she murmured. The sextant hadn't just been hidden. It had been buried in a place meant to be forgotten. So why dig it up now? There was only one reason someone would risk exposure after so many years. Fear. Fear that the past would speak. That afternoon, Inspector Crail called upon her once more, this time bringing with him a man she hadn't seen before, stern-faced, in a dark overcoat, with a gait that hinted at an old limp, perhaps from naval service. He wore a hat pulled low and gloves too warm for the weather. "Miss Marple," Crail began, "this is Mr. Gavin Markby. He arrived in Marchbolt 2 weeks ago, staying at the Black Horse Inn, registered as a writer researching coastal folklore." Miss Marple gestured toward the sitting chair by the fire. "Please do sit, Mr. Markby." He obliged, removing his gloves and holding his hands before the fire, though it barely crackled. "I understand you're inquiring into maritime instruments," she said lightly. "Indeed," he replied, his voice clipped, accent vaguely West Country. "Antique navigation tools. I write about their histories, though some become more interesting than others." Crail stood by the mantelpiece, arms crossed. Miss Marple nodded. "Would you mind terribly if I asked what drew you to Marchbolt?" Markby smiled faintly. "Local whispers. I'd heard of an old sexton who may have had ties to the Navy. A rumor about something hidden during the war years." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you believe he possessed something valuable?" "That's hard to say," Markby answered, too casually. "Often these stories are little more than fishing tales," Crail interjected. "And yet you arrived here just days before Ferris's death, and were seen loitering near the churchyard that very evening." Markby's jaw stiffened. "I walk in the evenings, Inspector." "It's a quiet spot." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "And what do you make of the bell ringing at midnight?" He paused. "Ghost stories," he said. "Charming, if you believe in such things." "Mr. Markby," Miss Marple said, her voice softer now, "I believe you've come seeking something real. The question is whether someone else got there first, or whether you feared they would." A long silence followed. Then Crail produced a small folded map from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. "We found this in your room. It's a nautical chart one, not sold commercially, marked in red. Coordinates we haven't yet traced." Markby said nothing. Miss Marple studied him with the detached gaze of someone observing a bird try to avoid the cat's stare. "May I ask," she said after a moment, "do the initials A.F. mean anything to you?" His face twitched, barely perceptible, but there. "No," he replied quickly. Too quickly, Crail noticed it too. "The initials were found engraved beneath the sextant's eyepiece," he said. "Someone tried to etch them out with a file but didn't succeed." "I'm afraid I can't help you," Markby said, standing abruptly. "If there's nothing else?" Miss Marple's voice cut through the quiet. "One last thing. Do you believe secrets buried at sea are best left to the waves?" Markby hesitated at the door. "Sometimes," he muttered, and then he was gone. Later that evening, Miss Marple made her way slowly to the Black Horse Inn, escorted by young Thomas Judd, who insisted on carrying her umbrella though the skies had cleared. The innkeeper, Mrs. Cheevers, was scrubbing the bar counter when they entered. "Evenin', Miss Marple," she said, pushing back a wisp of gray hair. "That writer fellow's just left, packed up, and vanished not 20 minutes ago." Miss Marple blinked. "Gone? Without notice?" Mrs. Cheevers nodded. "Paid in full, left the key. Said he had business in Weymouth." Strange sort asked. "A lot of questions about the tower stairs, and if the vicar kept old parish ledgers." Did he mention the name Atherton by any chance? Miss Marple asked. The innkeeper frowned. He did. Said he'd read a sea tale by a Captain Atherton. Wondered if he'd lived nearby. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with young Judd. Thank you, Mrs. Cheevers, she said, and turned back toward the lane, mind already churning. That night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple took out her diary of observations. She opened to the page marked Ferris, Lockwood, Atherton. She made several new notations. ATH, Atherton. Sexton from Naval Past. Ferris accessed the vestry ledger. Discovered link to what? Blackwood's late night appearance. Coincidence? Markby. Vanished. Lydia Froome saw lantern light. Past repeating itself. She paused. On a hunch, she flipped to the earlier page where she'd recorded the names from the parish register she had browsed. Briefly that Sunday, Captain Alaric T. Hatherley, retired 1916, buried 1937, ATH. She underlined it once. Then twice, suddenly. It all began to shift. Like pebbles rearranged by the tide, a pattern began to emerge. What if the sexton hadn't belonged to Ferris at all? What if it had been part of Hatherley's estate? Why had it been buried, and who had moved it after? All this time, the ringing bell. The frightened housekeeper. The vanished visitor. It wasn't over yet, but the path was clearing. And Miss Marple, who never once discounted the faintest flutter of intuition, knew the truth like the bell itself was about to sound. Chapter 10. The Ledger and the Lantern. Following morning broke crisp and still, with a pale gold sun that seemed determined to coax warmth back into the narrow lanes of Marchbolt. The village wore a quiet, expectant air, like a breath held in suspense. Miss Marple, however, had no time for idle observation. She was already dressed and seated in the modest study of Reverend Blackwood, who looked as though he had not slept. He offered her weak tea in a chipped porcelain cup. You wish to look at the parish ledgers, Miss Marple? Indeed, she replied, resting her handbag neatly on her knees. The older ones, if possible, especially those from the early part of the century. I've reason to believe they may hold a reference to one Captain Alaric de Hatherley. Do you recall? The name? Blackwood frowned. That does ring faintly. He was before my time, of course. Retired naval officer, I believe. Lived at Windward House for a number of years, but the property's long since passed to other hands. He led her to a tall cabinet of worn oak and withdrew a stack of leather-bound books. They bore the weight of years, pages yellowed, edges soft, but the handwriting within remained precise. Miss Marple pored over the pages with silent attentiveness. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, names that came and went like the tide. Then finally, Captain Alaric Thorne Hatherley, B. 1865, D. 1937, formerly of Windward House, Marchbolt. Interred at St. Swithin's. Eulogy delivered by Rev. Staniforth. Survived by no listed kin. She tapped the entry gently. Here it is. Nothing remarkable on the surface, but something tells me, Captain, Hatherley's legacy did not end in 1937. Blackwood studied her, puzzled. What are you suggesting? That something was hidden. Something valuable or damning. Perhaps Ferris stumbled upon it. She closed the book, and perhaps someone else already knew. There was a knock on the study door. Lydia Froome entered, her face pale. I beg your pardon, Reverend. Miss Marple, there's something you ought to see. 10 minutes later, the three of them stood beneath the looming tower of St. Swithin's. Lydia led them round to the rear of the vestry, where the earth had been recently disturbed. A shallow scrape in the soil revealed a folded piece of canvas. Cloth. I was walking Pippin, Lydia whispered. He kept sniffing this spot. I fetched a trowel from the gardener's shed. I don't know why, but Miss Marple knelt and gently opened the bundle. Inside lay an old oil lantern. Its glass cracked, the wick still blackened with soot. She turned it in her hands. The bottom was etched faintly with a monogram. A T.H. Blackwood exhaled. Good heavens. Used to signal, I suspect, said Miss Marple quietly. Perhaps to someone waiting at sea. A smuggler's lantern? Lydia asked. Possibly. Miss Marple stood. Or a final relic of something more intimate, a farewell, or a confession. The sort of thing one buries and hopes will never be found. She looked back toward the tower's stone walls. And, yet someone did find it, she added. Perhaps Ferris. Perhaps he uncovered more than just the sextant. That afternoon, Inspector Crail arrived at Windward House in a determined mood. The Markby angle had fizzled. The man had vanished too neatly, too cleanly. Crail had doubled. The patrol around the coast, but was increasingly convinced Markby had never come for the sextant at all. He'd come to verify something, then run when he feared being implicated. Miss Marple greeted Crail with a pot of fresh scones and her usual calm. I believe, she said gently, that we must look less at who has arrived in Marchbolt and more at those who have always been here. Crail raised an eyebrow. Meaning? The killer knew Ferris would be at the church that night, she said. They didn't follow him. They anticipated him. That sort of knowledge doesn't come from brief acquaintance. Crail looked thoughtful. You think it's someone local? I do, she said. And not just someone local, someone comfortable. With the church, the vestry, the routines. Perhaps someone with a reason to believe Ferris had discovered something. Crail leaned back. Blackwood? He would not have killed a man in his own sanctuary, she said. Though I believe he has hidden things, perhaps out of shame or misguided protection. Then who? Miss Marple picked up a scrap of the canvas wrapping from the lantern. I suspect the answer lies with those who lived through the war. Those who remember Hatherley and perhaps resented his secrets. As dusk fell over Marchbolt, the day's clouds returned in low layers. The wind carried a faint salt tang. From the church tower, the chimes rang out 7 times, nothing more. But as Miss Marple sat quietly on her bench in the vicarage garden, knitting in her lap, her eyes kept returning to the old yew hedge beyond the east wall. It had grown taller. Then she remembered. She rose and walked slowly toward it. Beyond, the path led toward the boundary of Windward House, now owned by a distant cousin of the Blackwood family, an eccentric recluse named Corwin Blackwood, who rarely left his rooms and had refused visitors for years. She had not thought of him until now, but something about the name echoed strangely in her mind. Corwin had been a boy in 1937, old enough to remember, old enough to bury something and carry the weight of it. Miss Marple returned to the house and made a final note. In her diary before bed, Corwin Blackwood, age 89, lived at Windward since youth. Connection to Hatherley, unspoken. Lantern plus sextant equals naval links. Ferris had key. Why? She underlined the word key twice. And then at the bottom, she wrote, if he saw the light once, he might have followed it again.